No one nation can deal with all the crises of our time, from terrorism to nuclear proliferation, mass migration, cybersecurity, climate change, as well as what we're experiencing now, pandemics.
We were and are in a crisis that knows of zero border. It's going to hit you and me and anybody else for that matter. So it requires global responses that can be universal.
A microscopic virus that's put us on our knees. We need more unity, more solidarity.
You cannot afford to slacken, and you must always think beyond what you imagine is likely to happen.
The only choice we have is between cooperation and insecurity.
Hello and welcome to a special GZERO live stream event, Mutually Assured Protection, Stronger Partnerships for a Healthier World. I'm Shery Ahn, anchor at Bloomberg Television. Our event today is brought to you in partnership with Flagship Pioneering, the bioplatform company that founded Moderna and dozens of other life sciences firms. GZERO would also like to thank two additional sponsors, Partnership for a Healthier America and Medtronic. In this program, we're asking some big questions about what global health will look like after the COVID-19 pandemic, and specifically the public and private partnerships it will take to ensure we never experience a crisis of this magnitude again. We've assembled some of the top leaders in politics, private industry, and science today. My co-hosts are Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, and Noubar Afeyan, CEO and founder of Flagship Pioneering. Thank you to you both. It's good to see you again. Of course, we had another program yesterday, and the focus was on health security and preventive steps. Noubar, let me start with you to set the tone for today's theme. When it comes to you being chairman of Moderna, what was your experience of how public and private entities came together, or at times didn't, in the past 18 months?
Thank you, and good morning. Yes, indeed, the last 15, 16 months has been quite extraordinary at the level of what it took to be able to accomplish what needed to be accomplished in order to prevent this virus from having even a bigger toll on humanity. Specifically, Moderna was a company that had been developing its platform for messenger RNA for now 10 years. And we were fortunate to have already partnerships with DARPA, part of the Defense Department, BARDA, and several other entities not relating to this particular disease, but just generally advancing the platform capability. Once the COVID-19 hit our radar, we forged partnerships with the NIH. We were already working with them at a research level, but now at the clinical trial level. We forged partnerships with other aspects of the government, most notably Operation Warp Speed. It seems like a distant memory, but only a year ago it didn't even exist. And they very quickly, the military and some private experts in vaccines came together to help facilitate this. And then we had private industry partnerships, companies like Lonza, companies like Catalent, Thermo, many. I mean, it's really remarkable. In the 34 years I've been involved in biotech innovation, I've never seen a tenth of this type of real commitment, putting away the small matters to get the job done. And I think what's very interesting looking forward will be, we mounted this type of a defense against a fast pandemic, but will we be able to maintain that same spirit against slow pandemics that we face all the time? And that's a really interesting question. No question, without no partnerships, none of the results.
Exactly. That's some of the points that we actually want to delve into during this conversation today. But Ian, Noubar just mentioned all of the encouraging signs that we saw during this pandemic coming together. But when it comes to the geopolitical space, the picture seemed a little bit different. It seemed to be that governments were all out for themselves, sort of your notion of the G0 world coming to life. What do you see as the state of global cooperation today?
There is no global cooperation today, despite all of the promising signs we've seen from the private sector and from global science and epidemiology. The US-Russia relationship is at its worst that we've seen in the early 80s. The US-Turkey relationship at its worst since probably the 70s, the Cyprus crisis. And the US-China relationship, the most important bilateral relationship in the world, is at its worst it's been since 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. So, I mean, if that's what I'm starting with, we can't talk about global cooperation. Now, the G7 And President Biden is just now making his first trip outside of the United States to Europe, principal American allies. It's about the EU, it's about NATO, it's about the G7. That's looking a little bit better. And certainly we hope that there will be the beginnings of greater collaboration from a group that didn't even meet, didn't even have a summit last year because of the focus, as you say, every nation for itself. I do think that Biden and the principal American allies around the world want to at least show that there is a desire to improve multilateral coordination, including on the pandemic, especially because these are the countries that are now starting to see the pandemic through their rearview mirror, can think more about the rest of the world that's still very much suffering and not close to getting through all of this. Having said that, it's not like America is suddenly back. We know that the Europeans look at the United States and recognize just how divided and dysfunctional the American political system is still and will be, Biden notwithstanding. We know that inside Europe, the UK and Brexit, the relations we see right now, Northern Ireland, the EU, those relations are incredibly fractious. The UK is America's top relationship in Europe. That's no longer helping the Americans with the Europeans, getting worse. Also, this is Merkel's last G7. And the French president, who sees himself as the new most important leader of the European continent, is also the one that's most autonomous from the United States. So we're going to fight some pretty significant headwinds, even though all of the science, all of the economics tell us that we desperately need more coordination going forward, especially on this issue.
So you're setting us the stage in order to talk about the multilateral cooperation that we need to see, the cooperation between countries in not only overcoming the pandemic, but really sustaining those efforts, right? I want to welcome two guests who are leaders of recovery efforts globally. Kristalina Georgieva is the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and Matt Hancock is the Secretary of State for Health in the United Kingdom, where, of course, the G7 will convene in just 2 days. Thank you both for joining us today. Let me start with you, Kristalina, because I want to talk about the upcoming G7. The World Health Organization's Dr. Tedros warned of this two-track pandemic, right? And warned the G7 that this is a critical meeting. What do you hope to see this weekend?
Great to be with you. I expect this to be a consequential summit in the fight against the pandemic. The ministers of finance of the G7 that met last weekend put a marker on international taxation, on fighting the climate crisis. They also had an in-depth discussion on the way we can bring the pandemic to an end everywhere. We presented a plan that the IMF has developed, endorsed by WHO, by the World Trade Organization, by the World Bank, and many others. I want to share the parameters of this plan, but then tell you what I expect the summit to be. The parameters of our plan start from the premises that a two-track pandemic means a two-track recovery, and that would hold the world economy back. If we want to see progress on the economic front, it has to be on the back of vaccinations. Vaccine policy is the most important economic policy. We believe strongly, and we presented the evidence that it is achievable to vaccinate the world to 40% by the end of this year, 60% by mid next year. If there is strong coordination, we lift up financing. We have a $50 billion price tag of this plan. And we also accelerate production, secure more than is necessary so we can actually deal with downside risks. And we help the developing world to get to a point of vaccinations. This has taken quite a lot of traction. So what do I see? I see the G7 coming up with upfront commitments in terms of financing, as well as early reallocation of vaccines they booked, but they don't need. That can lead to about 1 billion doses this year redirected from advanced economies to the developing world. I also expect there would be strong commitment to that very simple message: vaccinate the world, not in 23, not in 24, but in 22, so we can bring the pandemic to an end and the recovery to be on a sound footing.
Right.
Simply put, I want a summit that is the fair shot summit. Fair shot in the arm, fair shot at the future.
Yeah, that two-track recovery has been a key issue and something that really policymakers have been concerned about, right? What is the danger of that? Because I remember in your spring speech, you talked about Tolstoy and all the variety of life being made up of light and shadow. That divergence in the recoveries, what's the threat there for advanced economies, especially when it comes to spillover?
The threats to advanced economies are threefold. One, big loss of output that would have been achieved if we accelerate vaccinations. We judge it to be $9 trillion between now and 2025. 40% of this would occur in advanced economies. They would lose $1 trillion of tax revenues because the rest of the world is being dragged in the pandemic. Secondly, we know that mutations are now on a very fertile ground, and mutations can push again to stop and go type of economic performance in advanced economies. And three, when we have the advanced world moving fast with growth jumping up, then we would see, of course, withdrawal of accommodative policies faster.
Right.
If that happens and interest rates go up, while the emerging markets are still bogged down because of the pandemic and their growth falls behind, countries with high debt levels, especially dollar-denominated debt, would see trouble. That can then hit back at the advanced world.
So do you buy into the inflation narrative right now? Because that's a key concern, right? Why countries could move faster. Do you buy into the transitory rhetoric?
For now, the data shows that inflation is due to primarily supply disruptions that are likely to be overcome. Of course, for this, we need the whole world to be functioning well, because if it is not, we can have supply chain disruptions in the future. We also see more the positive of fast growth in the United States spilling over to other countries, but we are watchful because we have never experienced in the past a recession that was self-inflicted. And coming out of it with demand picking up is something that, of course, we have to be careful about. But I want to stress again, my main point is we have to overcome this dangerous divergence, because if one part of the world goes fast and the other one goes slow, then we would see, of course, the dangers of this transmission and a ricochet impact from the emerging markets to the advanced economies.
Let's bring in Secretary Hancock. Matt, great to have you with us. Of course, as Kristalina just mentioned, one of the ways for the world to recover together is really accelerating vaccinations. You have warned about the UK remaining vigilant. Tell us a little bit about how the UK vaccination rollout is coming along, and also when you could have the capabilities to actually share some of those vaccines with poorer nations.
Well, this is absolutely critical, isn't it? Here in the UK, we've now vaccinated just under 80% of adults with a first dose, and just over half with both doses. And so that is proceeding apace, and we're delighted that the uptake amongst especially older adults is over 95% on average, and we're lucky in the UK to have the National Health Service, so we have a single unified way of delivering these vaccines from a trusted source. But at the same time, I agree emphatically that it is vital to vaccinate the world. And I'm delighted to hear that there is support from the IMF and there's growing support behind Prime Minister Boris Johnson's call to commit at the G7, all of the countries together, to offer a vaccine to all across the world by the end of next year. Now, the way we're proposing to contribute to that from the UK point of view is first and foremost that offering the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine at cost has been we've been doing that for over a year now. It's being manufactured in 20 different sites in just under 20 different countries. And this vaccination through local production with a waiver on the IP charge, which has become of late a subject of some discussion. And I'm delighted Pfizer are now talking about doing that too in low and lower middle income countries. That is an incredibly important contribution. So too, of course, will be the direct provision of doses as and when we have excess doses. But you'll appreciate that as a health secretary, my first duty is to protect the citizens who I serve. But our goal has been to do that alongside making sure that vaccines are available at cost globally.
Matt, the theme of today's discussion is global cooperation, but we have seen the pandemic really separate nations and divide nations even more. Vaccine nationalism actually has been a headline in the past year. And we have seen now Bloomberg learning that the European Union and the US will be pushing for investigations into the origins of COVID-19. Will this just make things worse in the geopolitical scene?
Well, we are seeing now, thankfully, a coming together of like-minded nations. I think that the timing of the G7 summits this year is fortuitous because it is at a moment that many of the G7 countries are coming out of or seeing a more positive domestic picture, and we have to build that coalition amongst the like-minded democracies of the world. And in fact, at the G7 for the first time, we've invited guest countries: India, Australia, South Africa, the Republic of Korea. Now, of course, a true global effort is necessary. Of course it is, not just about understanding the origins of this pandemic, but to ensure that we have the proper early warning systems and, crucially, early action for any future pandemic. And the World Health Organization is undoubtedly the institution best placed to do this, and it needs reform to be able to act quickly and act independently. So we really need the funding reform for the World Health Organization so that it feels able to act according to what is objectively, scientifically needed, especially early after a new pathogen is discovered. So that will be part of the G7 discussions as well. It was when we met, the G7 health ministers met in Oxford, as it happens, and we concluded that work needs to happen. So there is now G7 consensus building on the work of Helen Clark and the IPPR for those who are interested in reform in this area. But the critical thing is having a World Health Organization and a group of like-minded allies all working together to get out of this pandemic and to prepare so we're better prepared as a world for the next one.
Kristalina, how are wealthier nations and poorer nations coming together on the special drawing rights? Is the IMF still on track when it comes to issuing $650 billion in reserve assets by the end of August?
We are very much on track. The G7 finance ministers confirmed that from the perspective of this very sizable group of countries, this is going forward. Not only that, we are looking into ways in which we can direct some SDRs from wealthier nations to those that so much need help. We expect by mid-August to have the governors voting on $650 billion. For those who may not have heard much about SDRs, this is a reserve asset we create on the strength of our membership, and it is the largest in the history of the IMF issuance by far, and rightly so, because we are dealing with the worst recession we have experienced in peacetime since the Great Depression.
Kristalina, some have criticized that the SDRs would be used to pay off the debts owned by developing nations to China. And this rivalry really on the world stage seems to be becoming worse right now. How is that affecting the job that you're doing?
Let me first stress that we provide very detailed guidance to countries on how best to use SDRs. And it is not in the interest of any nation that has large level of debt to use SDRs to pay rather than restructure this debt. Remember, we have the common framework. We want the common framework to be the door to resolve debt issues. And we also are increasing the transparency of how SDRs are being deployed by countries as a way to encourage the prudent deployment of this very valuable reserve asset. One positive piece of news is that China actually would like to make sure the SDRs work as intended, and they are indicating interest to contribute some of their new SDR issuance to a pool of funds at the disposal, or actually at the management of the IMF, to be directed to support countries in need. So the exact opposite of trying to use the SDRs for the payment service of debt to China.
Right, let me bring back Noubar and Ian into the conversation. And Noubar, just following up on what Kristalina was saying on this also rivalry that we're seeing on the global stage. When you were trying to secure all of these partnerships, when you were talking to all of these nations, what did you see on the ground? Because we have heard in the news, at least, accusations between Taiwan, between China, between countries that were having a hard time securing vaccines.
Well, I think the preceding months have been a shifting ground, if you will, because we started out early last year with relatively large pre-commitments that were made without really knowing which vaccines would be produced, how effective they would be, and whether there would be supply interruptions. And as those things happened, people's kind of decision-making started shifting. And of course, at that point, there were real shortages in supply, which we knew over a matter of months would be addressed, but it wasn't going to be addressed overnight. I do think there was a notion that if certain plans weren't right, they could somehow be corrected with additional resources being deployed. And unfortunately, that simply has not been the case. The way emergency use authorizations have been given, the restrictions that existed in how vaccines could be distributed. And so look, this is not something that as a company, Moderna, as a relatively new 10-year-old company, had been involved with, but many of our leadership had been involved in previous pandemics. And each one of these ends up with new lessons. And in this case, there really has been a lack of consistency, understandably, because the situation on the ground has been changing. But I do want to make the point that what Kristalina said, I completely agree with, which is that this is the time to make relatively small investments in health, particularly to prevent the effect of this disease. And the impact on societies and economies is huge. And I really think that we need to think about that return on that investment versus worrying about what that investment is, given just how much everything else is costing us over the last few months.
Ian, what do you think?
Look, I think the thing I really want to say is that what I've just heard from Kristalina and from Matt is by far the most substantive announcement of multilateral coordination that we have seen since the beginning of this pandemic. A commitment of 1 billion vaccines reallocated from the rich countries to the poor countries that have gotten almost none this far, dwarfs anything that we've had so far. I think that it's not going to resolve the issue. It's not going to bring us to what Boris Johnson has suggested, where we want to be by the end of 2022, where the entire world is vaccinated. That's a pretty large lift. It has the Chinese not involved at all. That relationship is getting worse. But let's not neglect that this is meaningful, that this is a game changer. And one thing I wanted to ask to Kristalina, if you don't mind, is in the context of that, and congratulations to both of you for getting this done truly, but I am wondering, there's been a big political football in the United States about to what extent these vaccines should be delivered through COVAX, multilateral, global facility, going to where the need is greatest, or whether it should be done bilaterally by the United States. And then, of course, political and economic and other transactional benefits can accrue. Does the IMF have a view as to whether or not it really matters where the US comes out on that political issue?
We are very keen to see upfront commitment to reallocate vaccine doses and upfront financing, the best public use of money in history, very likely. Just imagine 50 billion versus 9 trillion. We want to see these upfront commitments done. We hope the G7 would step forward. We hope the G20 will follow in the same spirit. We would like to see as much coordination on the allocation of vaccines as possible. We are putting together a task force between the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and IMF, with the objective to closely monitor how production translates into contracts, how contracts translate into delivery, and to what extent we are matching the needs and the distribution. Let's remember that we had in COVAX initially the noble intention delivered to everybody 20%, but not all countries are suffering the same way from the pandemic at any one time. COVAX does have an exception of this rule. So to answer your question concretely, COVAX is there, it is functional, it can play a big role, but we should not underestimate the logistical pressure on COVAX. So all hands on deck. As long as there is transparency on production, contracts, distribution, and we can see that we are in the speediest possible way vaccinating the world, I think we would be in a very good place. And I can tell you that I'm very encouraged that more and more countries are saying, look, we want most of what we do, we want to do it multilaterally, not bilaterally. And to the extent that we have high trust in some bilateral deliveries that can be expedited for highly vulnerable countries, we should not say, oh, no, please don't do that. Don't say these lies.
Sherry, can I tiny follow up for me? I just wanted to ask as well. I mean, you're so right. $50 billion in the context of what that will unlock for the rest of the world is absolutely nothing. We're talking about $3 trillion or more for U.S. infrastructure. I mean, Jesus, this is not a big ask from the G7. You told us about 1 billion vaccines being reallocated by the end of the year from the G7. Do you have any orientation you can give us in terms of the numbers we're talking about for financing commitments at this point? Is it in the 2 trillion? Is it the 2 billion, 20 billion? If you're asking for 50, can you give us any color there?
My expectation is that we would see in the tens of billions, not in the couple of billions. Already there is a very constructive discussion that took place at the G7 finance ministers as to how, for example, the replenishment of IDA, this is the concessional grant lending arm of the World Bank, how that can step up very significantly in the next months as discussions around IDA replenishment are ongoing. And let me clarify, our analysis shows that there is 1 billion doses that are booked in access to what is necessary in advanced economies, all advanced economies, not just G7.
Right.
And the G7 has to decide what they do, but very clearly by the end of this year, there can be 1 billion doses redirected from where they are more than necessary to where the needs are just terrific, terrible.
Kristalina, thank you very much for your insights today. Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF Managing Director, and also our thanks to Matt Hancock, Secretary of State for Health in the United Kingdom. Thank you to you both. It was an insightful conversation. Ian, Noubar, you're sticking around. We'll be back with you in a few minutes. But of course, we continue to discuss what global cooperation will look like, what it must look like, what it hasn't looked like in the past 18 months. And it seems to be that the answer for global problems are global solutions. So let's discuss what that practically means on the ground, what that really looks like when it comes to governments, nonprofits, and the private sector as well. Let me introduce and welcome retired 4-star U.S. Navy Admiral and former NATO Commander James Stavridis, Gargee Ghosh, the President of Global Policy and Advocacy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, also Agnes Binagwaho, Vice Chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda. Thank you to you all for joining us today. So let me start with the Admiral Stavridis. Thank you very much for joining us. I just want to start with this quote from the current NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who told Ian actually that NATO's main responsibility is to prevent this health crisis from becoming a security crisis. How has the face of what national security, global security looks like changed during the pandemic?
I think this gives a boost to something I've written and thought about a great deal, which is what is commonly called soft power. And this is the idea of using the capability, the logistic muscle, the knowledge, the boots on the ground in non-warfighting roles, but instead in humanitarian operations, disaster relief, medical diplomacy, in this case, vaccine distribution. As many will know, part of the response to the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa included deployments of troops from a wide variety of countries. I advocate for that strongly. We have enormous capability we built into these military systems. And sure, the Secretary General's right, their primary mission is security in a traditional way, but it's not an on and off switch, as in, they either go into combat or they just stay in the barracks. There is a lot that all of these militaries can contribute. They bring everything from big aircraft to lots of people. They know how to forward deploy. In terms of being part of the solution here, I think it would be a very capable and sensible mission. NATO would be one place to look at undertaking that.
Yeah, we have actually seen also here in the U.S. Navy hospital ships coming to help here in New York City, Los Angeles as well. Let me turn to Vice Chancellor Binagwaho and talk a little bit about the multilateral efforts when it comes to equitable vaccine distribution through COVAX. Of course, we have seen those efforts. We have seen shipments in developing nations. How successful has this been, and what more needs to be done?
It has not been successful. Whatever the head of IMF say, the issue is don't commit to what you cannot achieve. And the fact that it was expected that all the health workers across the world will be vaccinated so that we stop the spread of the disease is leading now to variants that we don't know when the current vaccine will no longer be efficient to. So there was effort, and we need also to understand that the efforts were global and came from everywhere. But so far, the countries that has given the most to Africa was India before they are under threat, and China. So, and it was criticized. That was the incredible part of that, saying they are doing vaccine diplomacy. Everybody is doing vaccine advocacy. However, in such a threat that has killed more than 3 million people on Earth, more than any war, more than any terrorist, a real threat for security globally, because it destroys health sector, economic sector, education sector. We should have gone for more solidarity, rapid trip waiver, rapid knowledge transfer, so that at least a region that can produce vaccine could produce more. And there are still regions who can produce now who doesn't produce when people are dying.
My family in Bolivia, in South America, my parents received the first Russian vaccine dose. So we do understand the need for these bilateral relations to also prosper. But that's what Kristalina was saying, right, Vice Chancellor, that it cannot just be a multilateral effort through COVAX, but also bilateral efforts. Where do you see this going from here? Is there going to be more a cooperation? And what is it that you want to see in Rwanda on the ground?
What I want to see in Rwanda on the ground is the place in the world where vaccine can be produced, that the world supports the production of vaccine. So the maximum of people that are vulnerable can be vaccinated now to stop the spread of the disease now and stop people to die now. The other thing in parallel is really bilateral, multilateral cooperation for manufacturing in the future, have more sites, and in my continent, have a couple of sites that can produce what my continent need, so that we stop to be the last serve when everybody is served and there are remaining things.
Let me turn to Gargee. What is the role that nonprofits and philanthropy can actually play in all of these issues that the Vice Chancellor has just raised?
Sure. Well, you know, the Gates Foundation has focused on global health for the past couple of decades, when it was neglected and before it became an issue of dinner table concern for all of us. So when this pandemic hit, we found ourselves with a network of research organizations, universities, as well as biotechs and companies, as well as strong partnerships with many of the multilateral organizations, a handful of countries. And we knew right away that this was going to be the critical threat to progress on all other fronts. And we've seen that happen. As Agnes has said, it has set back progress on poverty, on maternal health. Every indicator we track has been set back. Our role in this has been on the upstream side to really quickly mobilize resources to make sure some of the early stage research that we may have been pursuing for other purposes was available, accessible to the cause of COVID response. And hopefully that helped contribute to the rapid development of vaccines, the deployment of therapeutics, new diagnostic tests, and then to be part of the international system of response. And we have been working with the organizations, Gavi, Global Fund, WHO, and others on the African continent as well. The Africa CDC has been an exceptional first responder. I agree with Agnes that we are not where we hoped we would be a year ago. That doesn't mean we don't have work to do now, getting doses out quickly to stop this thing as fast as possible.
And Admiral Stavridis, Vice Chancellor Binagwaho also raised the issue of vaccine nationalism and vaccine diplomacy, and how sometimes when you got Indian or Chinese vaccines, that vaccine diplomacy was being criticized. Tell us a little bit about how the rivalry between the US and China have affected the global scene, the geopolitical stage, especially when you're trying to deal with a global health crisis. And where do we go from here?
Yeah, let's start with what should have happened. What should have happened is what everyone has been talking about, is a collective global response. And since they represent, the United States and China represent an enormous tranche of real capability in a perfect world, those two nations working with the European Union, working with others, would have stepped up and created a collective response. Unfortunately, we've seen, as you put it, vaccine, I'll put it this way, vaccine geopolitical competition, and which is an unfortunate reality, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and South Asia. And so that's the ideal, would be that these two nations, in this case, US and China, could work together from the very start. Unfortunately, that's not the situation in which we find ourselves. And so the question becomes, what should we do about it? And here I think you have to turn to international organizations, the international health community, universities like Agnes represents, foundations. Agnes and I, by the way, are both trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation. We have great admiration for the Gates Foundation. There are ways that these entities can come together, because the reality is the US and China, unfortunately, do not appear in a position to cooperate on this. I'll close by saying the split, if you will, is exacerbated by the ongoing sense of how did this start? Where did it come from? Those are important questions, and we ought to get answers to them. More important is, how can we work together moving forward in this pandemic and in the inevitable one that will follow?
Exactly, Gargee, as we prepare for that inevitability of another pandemic, what are nonprofits and philanthropic organizations doing at this moment? And does this rivalry that we're talking about in the geopolitical space affect your work?
Yeah, so we have been working with the health and R&D partners in China for many years. They have a track record of safe, effective products, Japanese encephalitis vaccine, anti-malarials. And I would also say that, as the Admiral says, there is a track record as well of cooperation to save lives, even in the face of very difficult geopolitics. So if you look at the eradication of smallpox, this happened because of the cooperation between the US and Soviet Union in the height of the Cold War. And so there is a reason to believe that global health and saving lives is a forum for collaboration. Looking ahead, I think preparedness will require collaboration in disease detection in sort of laboratory systems. It will require the kind of globally integrated manufacturing that Agnes talked about, so that manufacturing site location doesn't become a tool of rivalry. It will require collaborative R&D, so that we are covering the bases of where a future threat might come from. And so we're part of the technical community beginning to identify what the aspirational goals are for covering those bases, what good surveillance or disease detection might look like. And we'll need the political commitment of the kind your previous panel was talking about at the multilateral level.
We also
right,
know,
Agnes, please
yes,
go on.
We also know that other threats will come. And with the climate change, we are going to see emergence out of natural habitat of new microorganisms that can be very dangerous for us. If we don't set the cooperation, the synergy, and put health of the population health above everything, we are going to be in a worse situation next time.
Agnes Binagwaho, thank you very much for those insights. And yes, a word of warning and caution, of course, as we now are sort of preparing for the next pandemic after having experienced the last 18 months. Admiral James Stavridis, Gargee, Ghosh as well. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation. And of course, for those of you who are just tuning in, you're tuning in to a GZERO live stream event. We are talking about mutually assured protection, stronger partnerships for a healthier world. Our next panel will be talking about the private sector, how the private sector has really come together in an unprecedented way, mobilizing from the beginning stages of this pandemic, trying to manufacture personal protective equipment, masks, medical equipment like ventilators, to ultimately creating and manufacturing this COVID-19 vaccine. So let's discuss what is the larger role that these private companies can actually play in public health and pandemic preparedness. We're now joined by Greg Behar, the CEO of Nestle Health Sciences, Sundar Raman, President of Global Home Care and P&G professional at Procter & Gamble. Also, Junaid Bajwa is Chief Medical Scientist at Microsoft. Geoff Martha is the CEO of Medtronic. Thank you to you all for joining us today. It's an insightful conversation and really something that we should be watching when it comes to those private enterprises moving forward. Let me start with you, Geoff. In the early stages of the pandemic, we were all running out of masks, ventilators, hand sanitizers. It was really a difficult situation. Supply shortages, disruptions. How has the pandemic, Geoff, changed really the dynamics and the approach of the private sector to the supply chains?
Sure. Well, thanks for the question. I'd say, a couple of things. One, I would say partnerships with other companies. You're seeing great collaboration, between companies to rapidly improve production of certain scarce supplies. So, like in our case with ventilators, we struck up a partnership with companies we really never partnered with before, like Intel. Or to increase we're one of the world's largest ventilator manufacturers. And so Intel helped us improve the functionality of our ventilators right in the heart of the crisis. SpaceX helped us on the supply chain side, where we had some, shortage of certain parts, and SpaceX was able to, help us out there and remains a partner today. And then we had, manufacturing and distribution partners that, we never worked with before. All of these relationships were struck up during the pandemic and all around the world, not just the United States, but Southeast Asia, Latin America, Canada. So the partnerships and the collaboration between companies, I think, is great. The collaboration with government, I think, is something that I believe we got through it, but it could be better in terms of how do you allocate supplies that are in short demand based on need. Distributing these. Also, once distributing is not enough, once they're there, like things like ventilators can be complicated machines. The training of the people, of the healthcare workers. So I think much coordination with government, and that's something I would argue that can be improved going forward. And then the last I would say on this is with the government is making sure that we preserve the cross-border movement of supplies, because this got a little
right.
During the pandemic.
Border restrictions, lockdowns, and of course, right. This really gave us a chance to really look at how many different components it takes to get just one little product to the other side of the world, right? And this was something also that we were thinking even before the pandemic with the China-US tensions, the tariffs that went up in different places. So actually, we have a really fun audience poll to keep viewers engaged. Those of you who are watching on GZERO site on a desktop will see a chat window to the right of the video screen, or if you're on a mobile device, below the player. Sign in there to cast your vote on this following question. According to a recent global survey by Deloitte, what percentage of corporate executives believe supply chains need to be redesigned post-pandemic? Is it 25%, 60%, or 75%? I'll give the audience a few minutes to answer that question. But Geoff, let me just follow up on that question when it comes to supply chains, because we saw all of the disruptions. Are companies now thinking of redesigning their supply chains, of really building more redundancies in different parts of that link to get one product finalized built in one place and finalized in another?
Sure. I think in the answer I'd say is yes for certain products that are important to healthcare or national security. I do think that we need to be better prepared for those products and put business continuity measures in place, and be prepared for global supply chain disruptions. But one thing I don't think we can undo is the global nature of the supply chain. I mean, we've spent the last, I'd say, industry in general, healthcare, non-healthcare, has spent the last 20, 30 years globalizing the supply chain to improve the functionality of whatever product it is that you're talking about, and also reduce costs. And I think to the idea of undoing all that and going to a purely nationalistic supply chain strategy, I think that's not good for anybody. However, given that there's these geopolitical tensions from time to time that you talked about, I do think we need to look at certain critical supplies. And again, we're talking about healthcare here, so things like PPE, ventilators, and make sure that on a more national, regional basis that we have those prepared and aren't over reliant on too many parts of the world.
Right. Actually, we do have our audience having voted right now, when the majority, which would be 2/3 of the audience, voting for 75% of corporate executives believing supply chains need to be redesigned, actually gives you for thought that really perhaps a lot of the people watching this felt those supply chain disruptions. Even remember the time when we really didn't have toilet paper at one point and those disruptions. The correct answer, though, is 60%. So perhaps executives, yes, they are worried about these supply chains, about redesigning them post-pandemic, but not as many as the audience believes, is only 60%. Let's continue our conversation when it comes to the role of the private sector, Sundar, because we have seen, as many of our guests in previous panels have also talked about, really private enterprises coming together, building this partnership, just as Geoff mentioned. Tell us about the role the private companies play in a crisis of this magnitude.
Thanks for the question, Shery. It's a privilege to be here and share my thoughts. I'd say a couple of things. First, as Geoff mentioned, the past 15 months revealed truly, when a crisis hits, the speed with which we can mobilize resources to what needs to be done. And from a private sector standpoint, there are a few things that we do well, whether it's innovation, global reach in terms of advertising and communication, global reach in terms of distribution, maybe the efficiency or the speed with which we can do a few things, and whether it is at the local level. So just like Geoff mentioned, we had manufacturing facilities that stepped up immediately to make hand sanitizers or some surface disinfectants or PPE, or at the global level, including education about hand washing and videos on TikTok, or even global level force for good, force for growth initiatives. I think we saw the private sector step up in a way that was great to see. In terms of the role going forward, a company like P&G typically, is not the first thing that comes to mind when you think about health, when you think medicine, therapeutics, even though we do have a personal healthcare division. But really, there's another side to the coin, which is hygiene and cleanliness as a precursor to health, or personal hygiene and personal care as the other side of the coin when it comes to preventative measures. And there is clearly work that the private sector can do, and we are doing, in terms of whether it is partnership with other entities, whether within the private sector or public sector, to be able to bring those strengths to bear. The launch of Microban 24 for us as a disinfectant that could protect for 24 hours against bacterial infections, as well as how do we actually partner with other organizations for reach. These are things that, whether it's the Pampers UNICEF program on the vaccine side, or the Tide Loads of Hope program with the International Federation of the Red Cross and other organizations for disaster relief, we do have experience in partnerships that we can now apply to this world of health security and getting ahead of the problem, looking ahead to the next crisis that, as your previous panelists have talked about, it's kind of inevitable. But now I think our readiness can be different based off of the experience from this one.
Let me get to that point with Junaid, because private technology companies like Microsoft have really come together with science companies, right? So what do you see as the global cooperation outlook when it comes to technology and science firms moving toward this common good moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Shery Ahn, and very much echo the comments of previous panelists too. So I think the impact of the pandemic has been felt on individuals, communities, industries, and businesses. And if we go back to January 2020, when we didn't have the vaccines that we have today, all we had was information and noise, really, around what was happening when the pandemic started. And each country the pandemic hit, we had more and more information coming, almost like a wave of information. Like everyone can probably remember the John Hopkins graph that everybody was looking at, see the numbers trailing.
We're still looking at them.
Transparency of data, absolutely, and still looking at them today. Transparency of data, transparency of information, and people doing almost a wartime effort on translational research, thinking about actually what works, what doesn't work. By the time it hit the UK, and I still practice as a physician in the NHS, I remember us still tackling this question of what type of ventilation is going to work, looking at research from Italy, looking at research from China. And actually, I think technology companies had a role to play to both bring that information together, translate that, but then bring the best of that information to organizations such as Moderna and others to rapidly have the ability to create vaccines that we have today. So I think the speed at which we have seen science be a savior in this has been enabled and powered by underlying technology platforms to create transparency and disseminate that information. And we've seen even other technologies build upon that. So the approach of natural language processing now, multilingual natural language processing to analyze research papers, to identify what works and what doesn't work. Other technologies that it took a pandemic for us to see be adopted, such as telemedicine or video calls that we have today, things that would be completely out of the ordinary for physicians to even practice in a different way, now being the norm. I see science and technology, that convergence, being stronger now than ever before.
And Greg, let me turn to you as well, because of course it's not just about the virus and COVID-19, it's about a confluence of factors like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, all coming together to make just the situation even worse. So what can private companies really do to help change a society into a more resilient, into a more healthy one? Greg, the question was directed to you, if you can hear us.
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
all
we
right,
can hear
sorry.
you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shery, for the question. Listen, I think there is a lot that can be done, and we talked about it on the technology side, for example, how we provide access and easy education and continuous support to consumers and patients for health security. Let me give you the example of what we do, for example, in cognitive function, where we just heard that we have a drug approved for Alzheimer's disease. Well, at the end of the day, there is a lot more happening before you get there. And we have technology, we have products available, and how you get access to elderly people. We know today, for example, that 1 in 11 people are 65 and older. By 2050, it's going to be 6 out of 11. And so how do we provide those solutions and access faster with technology? We have end partnerships with regulatory and government. So, for example, with the NHS in the UK, we have a partnership where we give access on our weight management program that we provide. And we have partnered with a digital health company and the NHS to provide this integrated solution to 5,000 consumers and patients in the UK that suffer from diabetes and are obese. So this type of partnership across the board, I think, will make a huge difference over the long term. And the opportunities is tremendous, but we need to have this proactive approach on the three side. Companies like us, regulatory and government, and then also some technology companies that are willing to make the investment and help us in executing this type of projects.
Greg, you bring up a very important point, right? The willingness to invest, because this is something that also Junaid pointed to, the ventilation systems that need to be improved as well. Let me ask Geoff this one. You're the CEO of Medtronic. As a business, as a leader of a business, how do you make those judgments when you have to, first of all, invest for a healthier world? And it's all to do with balancing costs and margins, right?
Well, sure. I mean, look, we're a private company, and we have to deliver for our shareholders. But I do believe, like during the pandemic here, when and the ventilators are in short supply. We weren't even thinking about, short-term, profits. We ramped up our production 5x and made lots of investments that, in some cases, we had, 3 parallel paths going to do our best to supply the global need on ventilators. And, one of those paths worked. The other 2 we had to end up writing off. But, when the role of technology in healthcare, as Junaid was talking about earlier, is never been so apparent. The vaccine story is amazing, and I think companies like ours, need to think, bigger and longer term in terms of what we can be doing, redefining the art of the possible here. And the technology, I think, is the only path forward here, because we're trying to improve health outcomes, but at the same time reduce costs and increase access. And these are sometimes diametrically opposed, but technology can really make all those 3 goals, these universal healthcare needs, work together. And so it does take investment, but the need is so great. And from a business perspective, the market is so big, these type investments will pay off. But when you're looking for your returns going forward, I do think we need to start basing our returns on outcomes, not just volume. And I think that's where the United States and certain other healthcare systems need to reform here, is go from a volume-based system to an outcome-based system when you're looking at returns.
Right, Junaid, can the effort be sustained post-pandemic, post-emergency?
I think it's a fantastic question, and it's one that I ask myself on a regular basis. I sit on the board of a hospital, and I can just see the extraordinary effort that colleagues have put in over the last year, and they're exhausted just on the delivery side. And then you look at take the hospital and you think about the effort that Microsoft is putting in, and teams are exhausted. I mean, the pandemic hasn't stopped, right? The pandemic continues to be in full force in India today. It continues to be in full force, and we're preparing to see where else it might go with the number of variants that we have. What's reassuring is that we have a path forward with the vaccines today, and we understand more around the genotypic variations of the virus. So we're better prepared now than we have been. But we don't have to look too far back to the World Health Organization's report a few years ago that said by 2030, the world will have 14 million less doctors, nurses, and pharmacists on the planet than what society will need. So actually, we face a huge workforce crisis 10 years from now, at the same time as when we're expecting an aging population, possibly other pandemics. So we have a supply and demand issue here, which actually will just cause increasing pressures unless we do something as a global community to begin to address these from a resilience perspective, and perhaps push technology, automation, the appropriate and ethical use of technology such as artificial intelligence into mainstream, and allow us to see what more we could do if we were to unleash the true power of science and technology. But we don't just have the pandemic to deal with, and we should think about the issues holistically. And I really worry about the workforce issues. And I think Geoff referenced access before. Access will absolutely be dependent on those individuals' ability to deliver care to mass populations. And we really have to think about technology's role in improving access as well.
We want to continue this conversation with our next panel. So Junaid, Bajwa, Geoff, Martha, Sundar, Raman, Greg Reha, thank you very much for your insights today. We're talking about public-private partnerships and just continuing the efforts that we saw during the pandemic. We're still in a pandemic in many parts of the world where infections are still raging. We want to talk about how to be prepared for the future, whether it's through scientific or policy breakthrough. So let us welcome our next few guests. Moderna CEO Stéphane Bancel, as well as Amitabh Chandra, Professor of Social Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. It's good to see you both. Thank you so much for your time. Stéphane, let me just start with you and the COVID-19 situation right now, because here in the United States, it feels like we're going to some semblance of normalcy with more people being vaccinated. We're not wearing masks, and many of us are just walking down the streets. It looks fine. But so many other parts of the world are still dealing with raging infections. Are we going from a pandemic into an endemic virus period, given how widespread around the world this has become? And how is Moderna preparing for that transition?
Great. Well, Shery, thank you so much for having us today. So indeed, we believe this virus is not going away, unfortunately. It's way too late now. We think it's going to continue to evolve. and we are tracking very closely variants of concern. I think Moderna is doing two key things to help the world go back to an endemic setting where we can control this virus and learn how to live with it, like we are doing with many other viruses. One is the company has communicated that we are very committed to keep taking into the clinic variant of concern boosters that are specific to the variants. We have already shared clinical data that are very encouraging, and we're hopeful to have sometime in the summer the ability to get those new variant booster authorized so they can be used to boost people. So we keep people already vaccinated safe as they get potentially infected by new variants. The other piece is manufacturing. We are doing an extraordinary job this year to get 1 billion doses out of the door, which is remarkable. For context, in 2019, we had made less than 100,000 doses. This is 10,000 times more product. So that's an incredible industrial effort by our team and our partners. But what we decided with the Moderna board is to increase the capacity to 3 billion doses for 22, because we really want to stop the pandemic in 22. And this is require a lot of high quality vaccine that are adapted to variants, and then be able to go into the endemic phase.
So you mentioned getting approval by the summer. When could we see your first booster?
So sometime in the summer. It's a bit too early to tell now, but our goal is really before the start of the fall that we can start boosting people who are vaccinated last December or last January, because they are the highest risk, and we are worried about the variants that are spreading, including the Delta variant, and so we want to be very careful and be ready for it.
Do you have the capabilities to boost production of those boosters, enough vaccines out there?
So we are working to increasing the capacity to get there, yes.
So we are now seeing this conversation of intellectual property waivers at the World Trade Organization to help other countries also manufacture these vaccines. You've said in the past that doesn't really concern you. Why?
So what I've said is that it doesn't impact excuse me, Moderna in the short term, but I don't think it's the solution. If you think about it, there is no mRNA capacity available in the world. It does not exist. So even if a patent waiver was put in place tomorrow, for 21 and 22, the two critical years to get this pandemic under control, it will not add one more dose of mRNA vaccine into the world. The best chance the planet has today is to help Moderna, is to help Pfizer, to allow free export of product around the world, because actually adding players into the field will take away raw materials that are critical so that we can deliver vaccine in 21. So I don't think it's going to really impact it positively. The other piece we have to be careful is the negative side effects. Imagine, Shery, if 15 years ago, there had been an IP waiver. Moderna might not have existed, or Moderna might have existed in a much smaller scale of a company, and same for BioNTech. So if you think about how those two innovative companies came to really help the planet get vaccinated, we need to be careful of the unintended consequences of what might happen 5, 10, 15 years from now if IP waivers are authorized. And the last piece is Moderna, anyway, to ensure access, had said back in the fall that we will not sue anybody who are using our IP, because we wanted during the pandemic phase to maximize the number of vaccines available.
This seems to be a very sort of last resort effort for all of these countries to try to manufacture more vaccines, right? There are so many countries in dire need of these shots. What more can actually Moderna do? Can you help the creation and manufacturing of vaccines in other countries with other companies, transfer some technology, train them?
So unfortunately for 2021, most of the capacity that will be available is already called for in this industry because of a high safety and quality requirement. It takes 6 to 9 months to add a meaningful chunk of capacity. And given we are already in mid-June, there's nothing really that can be done for this year. What can be done is allowing free export of product, is for countries that have too many vaccines to share those vaccines with the low-income countries, so we can get as many people as we can vaccinated. To work also on shelf life. As you have seen, there are reports in the media that some countries have products that's soon going to be expired. This is really unacceptable. We should have had those vaccines shared much earlier.
Right. A key concern right now, right? Professor Chandra, let me bring you into this conversation. So what's the path forward towards not only greater capability globally to not only manufacture these vaccines, but as Stéphane was just saying, distribute them properly?
Yeah, it's let's just be clear to start with that all of these supply chain issues and manufacturing capacity issues are what happens when we wait for the pandemic to become a pandemic that can infect the world. None of these issues would have been relevant if we had vaccines available in May of last year or had mass testing available in the late spring. So these supply chain issues and manufacturing capacity issues were not inevitable. I think acting in time would have reduced these constraints. And let me just describe that before I answer your question. The genome for the COVID-2 was published in the New England Journal of Medicine on January the 24th, which is the same day, I think, or thereabouts, that the Chinese shut down Wuhan. Now, imagine this parallel universe that we want to create, where scientists at Moderna and Pfizer could start to have making vaccines on January the 24th with a platform that had already been proven by making vaccines for other older coronaviruses. And in this alternative universe, large shipments of mRNA vaccine would be manufactured, rushed to Wuhan, maybe given to the airlines that were flying people out of China. We wouldn't need to be producing 6 billion vaccines. We would be needing to produce maybe 200,000 vaccines if we had kind of thought about an investment in this platform technology many years before this pandemic. So my own sense of the direct answer to your question today, though, is that the manufacturer, the final manufacturer, Moderna, Pfizer, probably knows the most on how to bring more manufacturing capacity online. And so I think we should allow them to figure out what alliances, contracts, partnerships they need to supply adequate vaccines to the world. We should approach them and say, how much money do you need?
Stéphane, what would you say to that? What do you need?
So right now, we just need to be able to do our job. And as Professor Chandra said, we've announced we are building capacity for 3 billion doses. That is a gigantic number. If the world needs more, we would, of course, be happy to do more. We recently signed a partnership with COVAX for 500 million doses. And I told the COVAX leadership, if you need more, just tell us. But you need to tell us now, not a week before you need the dose, because there's a long lead time to get the space, design the machine, raw material, hire people and train them. But we know how to do that. What we need is very clear guidelines from the G7 and the world of what is needed. The big challenge we have, we should not forget, is there was no mRNA product approved before the pandemic. In the future, what would be great is we have the ability next year to make 250 million doses a month. So in the parallel universe that Professor Chandra was talking about, think about if we have started making products just by July of last year, we could have had 1.5 billion doses. And I think by investing in pathogen of concerns, we're working with Dr. Fauci's team, on Nipah. We're working with BARDA on Zika. We need to develop around 20 pathogens worth of human data in vaccines so that we know the dose required, so that we have enough of a safety database. So as Professor Chandra was saying, we can just run to a new emerging pathogen of concern next time this happens.
So Stéphane, when it comes to your own technologies, what do you envision the future of Moderna to look like? The applications of your new sophisticated cutting edge technology?
So on the vaccine front first, we are working on many innovative vaccines where virus hurts people. Since 1980, for the last 40 years, there's been 80 new viruses hurting humans. There's only vaccine approved for 3. So there's huge opportunity for a company like us to go and develop those vaccines so we can protect people and people don't get sick and people don't die. 2, there are vaccines on the market today that don't have great efficacy. The best example is flu. In a good year, the flu vaccine is 60% efficacy. In a bad year, 20 to 30%. The world deserves a 90-95% efficacy flu vaccine. And our goal is to do that and to then combine it with COVID boosters. So you get one single dose in the fall and you have a good winter. So that's for vaccine, and there are many more vaccines I don't have time to talk about. On the therapeutic side, we have 5 drugs in cancer. We have a drug in cardiology that we inject in people's heart after a heart attack. to grow new blood vessel in their heart, to revascularize their heart so that the ejection fraction, the ability of the heart to pump, comes back. We're working on rare genetic disease, we're working on autoimmune disease. And so we keep expanding the possibility of this technology. We believe now more than ever that mRNA is going to transform medicine in a very profound way in the next 10 to 20 years.
Do you need new investments?
We have now, fortunately, a situation of being cash flow positive. And so we're investing very aggressively. Our investment in R&D have increased 3x, not 3%, 3 times Q1 last year to Q1 this year. Our investment in IT 4 times. And we are investing literally billions of dollars to get those $3 billion of capacity for next year.
Professor Chandra, in order to sustain this effort and look at the global health issues long term, how do you keep that momentum going from a pandemic, from the emergency situation to actually after the emergency subsides?
I think just a small crash course in, it's a great question, because I've always thought that there's this incredible urgency and excitement. That's what's great about living through this mess, is that we're finally thinking about something that we ought to have been thinking about. But to your question, how do we sustain it? Well, we can just put the current pandemic into some perspective. If you total the economic loss to the US economy alone, just the US economy alone over the next 10 years, this Congressional Budget Office estimates it to be about $7.5 trillion. Now you add to it the health cost, the lives lost, you get another $7.5 to $8 trillion. So that's $16 trillion. That's close to 1 year of US GDP has been lost. This is, to compare that to the Great Recession, the Great Recession was only 1/8 the size of the $16 trillion hit that we have taken. The economic loss of $8 trillion is more than twice the total monetary outlay of all the wars that the United States has fought since 9/11, including those in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. So, it's another way of saying, if the cost of the pandemic is going to be of the order of magnitude of 1 year of US GDP, we've got to start to think about how much we're willing to spend on the insurance policy. And the insurance policy would be the investment in the technologies that prevent this from happening. What are we willing to spend? Now, if you think we're willing, maybe we spend $20 billion a year. That $20 billion, right? Suppose we would agree as a country, we're willing to spend $20 billion to rescue us from a $20 trillion catastrophe. That would be, 0.1% of the loss. That's a really, really, really good insurance deal.
Right.
So if I was advising CBO and the federal government, I would make them wear much more of an actuarial hat to think about how to do it. It's well within our economic and scientific grasp to do this.
Put the numbers out there so they can figure it out that it's much better to invest now. But how do you make the decisions for smart investments, whether it's in public health infrastructure, as we've seen during this pandemic, where the divide and the gap between the haves and have-nots has been very, very much exposed?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think the rescue here, no one likes to say this, but everyone, and I know Stéphane is on the call and he's going to be very upset when I say this, but the real unsung heroes here are capital markets that made all these investments in all of the biopharma companies that have brought these drugs to market. But the capital markets do respond to the quality of the basic science. And if you look at the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease, their annual budget allocation is $6 billion. So here we are, a $20 trillion economy trying to avoid a $20 trillion loss. What's the investment we put up? $6 billion. That's 0.03% of the potential loss. Not 1%, but 1/33 of 1% of GDP. So I think that, again, we ought to triple the NIA, the public investment here to induce the science. And I don't just mean science in the sense of drugs, but science in the sense of basic epidemiology. One of the biggest mistakes we made with this pandemic a year ago was we used the epidemiology of the flu. which is a colossal mistake. The coronaviruses aren't moving, at least this one is not moving the way the flu works, right? We thought it would be droplets that would pass it on. We were completely wrong on that. I think we just need a lot more investment in that science and epidemiology. And the good news is it's very cheap. It's very cheap.
Stéphane, are you making those investments in that sort of research? Because of course, we still have to contend with the seasonal flu.
Yes, very much so. We're investing in basic science to keep increasing the potential of application of messenger RNA. We're investing in research to develop new vaccines to protect more people against viruses for which there is no vaccine on the market. And of course, manufacturing as well. And actually, I will totally agree with Professor Chandra about the capital markets. Moderna, to get to this point, had to raise $5 billion of capital to build the company. We would not have been ready for the pandemic if the markets and the venture capitalists could not have been here to support us. And the other piece we should not forget, last year we spent the first quarter begging governments around the world for money. We got not a penny. We are begging foundations to get money. We didn't get a penny. It's on May 18, after we had the phase 1 very early data on a few dozens of people that went to the capital market, and where we raised $1.3 billion to invest all the proceeds in machines, raw material, hiring manufacturing people. If the capital market had not been there, Moderna would have had a much lower output when the vaccine was approved, millions of lives lost. And so I totally agree with you, Professor Chandra.
And if you set the IP waiver as a precedent at the WTO, could this become a problem where capital infusions wouldn't have come in if you really have no ownership later on, especially for those more replicable technologies?
That's what I mentioned earlier, Shery, which is I don't worry about what happened to Moderna next quarter or next year if the IP waiver happens. Again, it will not help to get one more dose of vaccines to the market to people who need them. But the big risk we have if this waiver happens is what could happen down the road. Because if 10 or 15 years ago a waiver like this would have been put in place, I worry that Moderna would not have been able to raise all the capital we raised to build the company, to invest in the science, again, $5 billion, not million, billion. And Moderna will not have been ready. And same for BioNTech, it's the same capital markets. And so I think we have to be very, very careful of the unintended consequences of things that looks great today, that by the way will not have one dose of vaccine, but could have very damaging long-term effects.
Shery, can I just add to what Stéphane said? I worry, in addition to the point he was making, that the amount of time it will take us, the WTO, to work out the details of the vaccine waiver, it could take months, years, and it could even prove to be absolutely impossible. So this waiver approach is actually a death sentence. We're telling people, we have a vaccine. You could have the vaccine if your government paid for it. We're choosing to go down this path, which sounds fantastic, and you will die as a result of this. So I think it's actually incredibly irresponsible. So this is a different point than the one Stéphane was making. I think it's just a death sentence to go down this waiver route.
Well, those negotiations continuing at the WTO, we'll see what happens with those economies really having those discussions. But Amitabh, Chandra, thank you very much for your insights. Stéphane, Bancel, great to have you with us. We want to end this program now and bring back Noubar and Ian, because Professor Chandra was just telling us about how this would not really be the right way forward. And Noubar, let me get started with you. What are your key takeaways and perhaps a note for the future outlook of where the world is headed for a healthier future?
Well, yes, that was a fascinating ending discussion, and the whole session, certainly today and yesterday. Let me say two important observations that came out here and there, but let me see if I can just kind of summarize them. The first thing is that in the discussion around the vaccine, I think one of the things we have to realize is that 35, 40 years of biotechnology investment later, we have now entered a completely new era. The era we've entered is no more profound as the internet was to the software industry, that is for the biotech industry. And that is, we are now talking about the design and the operation of platforms that can create products that are designed to work. That's a very different paradigm than the way the pharma industry has worked for many decades, where there's a principle of shots on goal. Everything has a very low probability. Every drug is completely different. You barely know how it's going to work. And the notion of design or having information molecules that can be reprogrammed quickly, none of that existed. Messenger RNA really set the groundwork for that, and Moderna is a platform company. But there are now dozens more platform companies that are coming along with solutions that I would say, from a policy standpoint, from an investment standpoint, have to be thought of as rather getting closer to a deterministic world than a purely probabilistic world. I'm not saying that every single one of these will work, but I am saying that when they don't work, we should be surprised, versus when they do work, we should be surprised. That's one observation that I think further emphasizes the degree to which investments in underlying platforms and technologies could have these types of profound ramifications, as we just saw. The second observation I'd make, which is really what this whole 2 days were meant, kind of designed to be about, is a discussion about health security. As we go forward from this pandemic, the notion that we've endured this much pain, this much loss, and then we just basically say, okay, now the snowstorm's over, we're back out again, everything's fine, I hope it doesn't happen again, would really be an affront to the people who lost lives and the people who are going to be suffering with this disease for decades to come, or the after effects. So what do we do instead? And there's a lot of policymakers here. I would argue that what we've endured is in large part due to the fact that our healthcare system is in fact barely a healthcare system. It is a sick care system. We wait till we're all good and sick, and then we deploy extremely expensive, sometimes effective treatments. And I'm saying this having spent 35 years developing many of those products with colleagues. Instead, if we said that we should not wait for sickness to deal with the consequences, but actually think about it upstream. That's what we mean by health security. That's what we mean by preemptive medicine. Then, of course, in that world, vaccines don't become this commodity kind of afterthought that we deploy when things go bad, but actually they become the most celebrated, the most effective health tools. We heard this morning mention of vaccines being perhaps the most effective human invention in terms of human health ever done. Certainly they were in COVID-19. So the second takeaway I would say is that we have to collectively aspire to a world where we are ensuring the security of the health of the population, not simply deal with it when it goes bad. And if we can do those two things, count on platforms to make this much more effective and predictable, and deploy capital to ensure health protection, not reaction, I think those two things would be a game changer. And at least it will have been sadly painful, but something good would have come out of what we've just experienced.
Ian, Noubar and you wanted to have these conversations because you didn't want to lose this opportunity of the moment.
Right. No doubt. Yes. I mean, Ian, you should join in. No doubt. I worry because we don't have one Moderna. We have 20 different companies that are going after this. And if the notion that all of this ends up being the genie gets put back in a bottle and we say, okay, we just made it through, let's move on, let's change IP regulations and the like, that will be a new pandemic, a pandemic of thought.
I mean, you just heard, no, that's fine, Noubar. We are old friends. There is no issue. You just heard from the last panel about how little we have invested as a country, as the G7, as the West. You heard it at the beginning from the head of the IMF in terms of how much return you could get just by ensuring that the world gets vaccines, so much less than we're talking about spending, and surely so much of it wasted inside the United States and ourselves. And you also heard about the paucity, the dearth of investment in basic sciences that will allow us to get farther upstream in dealing with health security as opposed to only treating people after they're already sick. We have the language for this. Right? I mean, you already see the Biden administration saying, we've got to invest in semiconductors. We're behind on 5G. Why? Because otherwise the Chinese are going to eat our lunch. Well, how can we not be saying that at all in investing in health security for our nation and for the world? It's so much more fundamental than what's on our smartphones. I mean, we would have been in such better shape in being able to talking about opening our economies more quickly, more easily, getting our kids back into school, getting businesses up and running again, as opposed to the long-term knock-on, sort of mental illnesses that we're going to suffer as a consequence, the impact of people that are going to have longer-term poverty that they can't get out of, that you can't deal with, all the disruption. Why? Because we didn't invest in basic resilience and human capital. And so it's fantastic that we have these revolutionary technologies, many of whom that have actually created and funded them, we've heard from today and yesterday. That's a great thing. And it's great that the United States, the world's most powerful economy, and also one that still has rule of law, that still has an independent judiciary, that still cares about intellectual property, is driving that. If it was coming primarily from China, we'd have a different problem right now. But right now, if you ask me what the baseline expectation should be, it's that we look at this in the rearview mirror. We invest more in the ability to identify viruses and build more vaccine capacity. And the Americans are still completely underprepared as a population to be healthy and functional. And in 2021, with everything that this country stands for and represents, to have that as your principal outcome is deeply unacceptable, period. This is the biggest crisis of my, yours, and Noubar's lifetimes. And this is the lack of lessons we're going to learn from it. So, I mean, Noubar and I certainly believe that to the extent that we can do anything with our platforms and the connections we have, we've got to deliver this message. That's what we try to do today and yesterday. And I was delighted to see so many like-minded, kindred spirits from the US and around the world want to join us.
Keeping up the momentum, let's not waste this opportunity. Every crisis is also an opportunity. Ian Bremmer, Noubar Afeyan, thank you so much for bringing these conversations together. It was really a pleasure to be with you all. To see more content from GZERO's partnership with Flagship Pioneering, head to gzero.media.com/health security. Thank you all for watching. Let's keep up the momentum. Let's keep talking. I'm Shery Ahn. Have a great, safe, and healthy day.